Good morning, students. So today's topic is the neuroanatomy of pons and midbrain. So the last neuroanatomy classes you have studied about spinal cord and medulla. So continuation of the medulla, that is the pons and midbrain, because all these three are the parts of the brainstem. From below upwards, the medulla, pons and midbrain. So the competencies for the two topics. For the pons, these are the competency, and for the midbrain, these are the competency numbers. So the learning objectives of today's class is for the pons. So by the end of the session, you should be able to describe the external features of the pons, so which are present on the surface, ventral surface and dorsal surface of the pons, and also demonstrate the external features. Then you should be able to identify the features present in the cross section of the pons. So there are two sections at the pons. One is at upper level of the pons and one more is at lower level of the pons. The same silent features which are learning, you should be also able to practice the diagram of the pons at these two levels. So the diagram, practicing the diagram of the two cross sections is very important. Then enumerating or describing the cranial nerve nuclei of the pons present at both the levels, and the functional components of the cranial nerve nuclei. Then blood supply of the pons and the applied anatomy related to the pons, resulting the trauma or the hemorrhage caused because of the any injury to the blood vessels of the pons. The learning objectives for the midbrain is same again. The external features of midbrain, describing and demonstrating. Then you should be able to know the silent features, and also you should be able to draw the sections of midbrain. So again in the midbrain also there are two sections. One is at the level of superior colliculus, one more at the level of inferior colliculus. So both in the pons and in midbrain there are two sections. So total you are going to learn about 4 sections today. 2 sections of the pons and 2 sections of midbrain. Okay. So similarly in the midbrain you should be able to enumerate and describe the functional components of the cranial nerves present in the midbrain, the blood supply of the midbrain, and describing the applied anatomy in related to the blood supply of the midbrain, as well as the anatomical basis of Parkinson's disease. Okay, so this is a picture showing the parts of the brainstem from below upwards. So this is the medulla oblongata, which continues upwards as the pons, and this is the midbrain. So all these three together is called as the brainstem. So in the middle is the pons, okay, and towards the cranial part is the midbrain, which is connected to the two cerebral hemispheres by means of the peduncles called cerebral peduncles. So first is our topic is pons. So the pons, it connects the medulla and the midbrain. So it lies in the junction of the two parts of the brainstem. So the main function is it transmits the information from the spinal cord and the medulla to the higher brain, that is towards the cerebrum and to the diencephalon. So the name pons is given because it is bridging between the cerebellum, okay, and as well as the midbrain. So that's why it is called as the pons. So it is at the junction. So it bridges across the cerebellar hemispheres. So this is one half of the hemisphere, that is cerebellar hemisphere. So it is bridging here, and it also lying in between the two parts of the brainstem, that is the midbrain above and medulla oblongata below. So since it lies at the junction of all these structures, it is called as the pons. So this pons, the external features are it has two surfaces and two borders. So the two surfaces of the pons is the ventral surface and the dorsal surface, okay, which is also called anterior and posterior surface. So the dorsal surface or the posterior surface, what you are seeing here in this picture. So this is the dorsal surface of the pons. This is the medulla here and this is the pons. So this pons is having a peduncle here which is called as middle cerebellar peduncle that connects the pons to the cerebellum. Okay. So now on the dorsal surface of the pons, you can see this complete surface is covered or overlapped by the cerebellum, and separating these two, the dorsal surface of the pons and the cerebellum, there is a cavity, a rhomboid shaped cavity here, which is called as the fourth ventricle. So the fourth ventricle separates the dorsal surface of the pons from the cerebellum. Okay, so in brief, what you have to remember is the dorsal surface is related to the fourth ventricle and further to the cerebellum. Okay, so in this picture, you can see the two surfaces of the pons. So this is the dorsal surface or posterior surface, and now this is the ventral or the anterior surface. So now on the ventral on the surface, the pons, it is convex. The ventral surface is convex, and in the midline there is a groove which is called as basilar groove, which lodges an artery which is called basilar artery. So this is the artery which is supplying the the brainstem as well as the cerebellum and the brain. So this basilar artery, what it is, you will study in the blood supply of the brain. Now, on the surface of the pons, you can see there are transverse ridges running transversely. Okay, so these transverse ridges they converge towards the cerebellum and they form a peduncle that is called as the middle cerebellar peduncle. So the brainstem is connected to the cerebellum by means of three peduncles: inferior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and superior cerebellar peduncle. So inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the medulla with the cerebellum. Middle cerebellar peduncle connects the pons with the cerebellum, and superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain with the cerebellum. Okay. In addition to that, on the dorsal surface of the pons, junction, so this is upper border here and this is the lower border of the pons. So junction between the lower border of the pons and the medulla, we can see the origin of the cranial nerves, that is the 6th, 7th and 8th cranial nerves. Okay, so these corresponding nuclei will be present in the internal features of the pons. Okay, so the emergence of the three nerves, that is 6th, 7th and 8th cranial nerves, are present between the junction of the pons and the medulla, that is at the lower border of the pons. Now this is the superior border of the pons. So where you can see there is two bulky mass of fibers running here, which are called as the cerebral crus cerebri or cerebral peduncles, which is a part of the midbrain. Okay. So that is the ventral surface here. Again, it is convex. It has transverse ridges. So these transverse ridges are because of the fibers present beneath the or interior to the pons, which constitute of the fibers called pontocerebellar fibers. Means the fibers are running from the pons to the cerebellum, which further form the middle cerebellar peduncle. So there is a sulcus which is called basilar sulcus, which lodges an artery that is called basilar artery. Okay. Then junction between the middle cerebellar peduncle and the ventral surface of the pons, there is attachment of the 5th cranial nerve, that is the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so the trigeminal nerve, the 6th nerve, that is abducent, 7th facial and 8th vestibulocochlear nerves emerge on the pons. So now coming to the internal features. So the internal features are best studied by taking the section of the pons. So two sections are taken. The first section is at the lower part of the pons. Okay. So that is at the level of facial colliculus. Okay, why it is called facial colliculus? When we study the internal structure, you will understand. And one more section is called the upper part. So where it is taken at the emergence of the trigeminal nerve, which contains the motor and sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So these are the two sections. One is lower pons, the other one is upper pons. The section of the lower pons is called as the TS of pons at the level of facial colliculus. The section which is taken at the upper part of the pons is called as the TS at the level of the motor and sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Okay. So whatever level it is, either the upper pons or if it is the lower pons, the internal structure is divided into two pons. The ventral part is called as the basilar part. So this is the basilar part, and the dorsal part is called as the tegmentum. So this complete part is called tegmentum. So both in the entire pons, the internal structure has these two components. The basilar part is the ventral part and the tegmentum is the dorsal part. So the basilar part, it remains same along the entire length of the pons, whereas the tegmentum part, it differs in the two levels. So it differs, the two levels is the upper and lower part of the pons. So first we'll see the ventral or the basilar part. So the ventral or the basilar part is nothing but it is a continuation inferiorly with the pyramids. Okay, so it is continuing with the pyramids. These are the pyramids. It continues with the pyramids of the medulla, and on each side it will be connected with the middle cerebellar peduncle. So what is present within the basilar part or the ventral part? So there is presence of both grey matter and white matter. So the grey matter of the basilar part consists of nuclei which are called as the pontine nuclei. So what you are seeing here, these are called as the pontine nuclei. So these pontine nuclei constitutes the grey matter of the basilar part. So this pontine nuclei, it receives afferents from the cortex, cerebral cortex. So they are the fibers running here. This arrow marks you can see here. This represents the fibers running from the cortex, which are called as the cortico-pontine fibers. So they relay in the pontine nuclei here. So these fibers, once they relay here, now they run transversely towards the middle cerebellar peduncle that forms the transverse fibers. So they are called as pontocerebellar fibers. So these fibers reach the cerebellum, so they are called as pontocerebellar fibers. So together, all together, it makes the cortico-pontocerebellar fibers are the pathway. Okay, so these are the fibers. Okay, the transverse ridges which you have seen on the dorsal surface of the pons is because of these fibers, the pontocerebellar fibers. So that is the presence of pontine nuclei is the important feature in the basilar part. Now coming to the white matter present in the basilar part. So the white matter is nothing but what I have explained now, that is the fibers, the longitudinal fibers and the transverse fibers. Longitudinal fibers is the fibers coming from the cerebral cortex, so which will reach towards the spinal cord and which will also reach towards the reticular nuclei. So it is called as the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. The transverse fibers I have already told, they are reaching towards the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle called as pontocerebellar fibers. So that is the basilar part. So basilar part contains the pontine nuclei, longitudinal fibers and transverse fibers. Now coming to the tegmentum part. Okay, the ventral part here. The tegmentum part, the dorsal part, that is the tegmental part. So this tegmental part, it differs in the upper and lower pons. Okay. So what is this tegmentum? It is the continuation of the medulla excluding the pyramids. So I have told basilar part is the continuation of pyramids. So now the tegmentum is the continuation of the medulla excluding the pyramids. So like in the basilar part. The tegmentum part also has the gray matter and white matter. So white matter is made up of the tracts, both the ascending tracts and the descending tracts here. And the gray matter constitutes of the cranial nerve nuclei of the nerves, that is the trigeminal nerve, abducent nerve, facial nerve and vestibulocochlear nerve. So all these nerves you have seen on the surface which are emerging out between the junction of pons and the medulla. So now on cross section of the pons at the level of the facial colliculus. This is nothing but the lower pons. Okay, facial colliculus level means it is a section of the lower pons. So now what is the gray matter present in the section of the pons at the facial colliculus? So the gray matter includes the nucleus of the abducent nerve. So in the picture you can see here. So this is the nucleus of the abducent nerve. Then you can see the nucleus of the motor nucleus of the facial nerve. So the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, the fibers make a loop around the abducent nerve which causes an elevation on the dorsal surface of the pons, and an elevation is formed here which is called as the facial colliculus. So because of the looping of the motor fibers of the facial nerve, the elevation is formed, that is called facial colliculus. So we call this section as the section at facial colliculus. Okay. Then there is a nucleus, salivatory nucleus, which is present medial to the motor nucleus of the facial nerve. Then there is the vestibular nuclei and also the cochlear nuclei, both the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. Then there is the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve with the tract, spinal tract. Okay. Then another important feature present here is the nucleus of the trapezoid body. So this is the trapezoid body beneath which the nucleus of trapezoid body is present. So these are the gray matter present in the section of the facial colliculus. Okay. So you remember the nerves which are emerging from the pons. So you can remember the cranial nerve nuclei present in the tegmental part of the pons at the level of facial colliculus. So okay, the facial nerve, the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, it makes a loop around the abducent nucleus and emerges out of the pons. So this looping of the fibers of the facial nerve around the abducent nucleus is called, the process is called as neurobiotaxis. So the functional components of the cranial nerve nuclei present at this level is, so you have seen there is a motor nucleus of facial nerve, then there is salivatory nucleus, abducent nucleus and trigeminal nucleus and nucleus of tractus solitarius. So these are the functional components. So already you know, you have studied here in the previous class of the medulla what are all these functional components. So now the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, it carries the fibers, that is some special visceral efferent fibers, whereas the salivatory nucleus, it carries the fibers which are called as the general visceral efferent fibers, and the nucleus, that is the tractus solitarius, it carries the fibers which are called as the special visceral afferent fibers, and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, it carries the fibers which are called as the general somatic afferent fibers. So then there is the nuclei of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So this vestibulocochlear nerve, it carries the special somatic afferent fibers for the sensation of equilibrium and hearing. So in this chart you can see what is meant by the functional components and what is the nuclei and what it distributes. So in the pons we have seen the 6th, 7th and 8th cranial nerves. Okay. So first we will see the 5th cranial nerve. So where you have seen the spinal nucleus. Okay, the spinal nucleus where it supplies the skin of the face and mucous membrane of the mouth and the nose. So the functions is it carries the fibers of pain and temperature. Then you have seen the abducent nerve where it carries the fibers of the somatic efferent fibers, okay, which supplies the lateral rectus muscle that causes the abduction of the eyeball. Then we have seen the facial nerve. So where there is salivatory nucleus, there is motor nucleus and nucleus of tractus solitarius. So salivatory nucleus supplies the submandibular glands which are called secretomotor fibers. Then the motor nucleus, it supplies the muscles of facial expression and stylohyoid muscles. So all these you have studied when you are studying in the embryology also. Then there is a nucleus of tractus solitarius which carries the special visceral afferent fibers that carries the taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Then the cochlear, the vestibular and cochlear nuclei which will carry the special somatic afferent fibers for hearing and equilibrium. So now coming to the white matter. So what all you have seen now is the gray matter. Then coming to the white matter present in the section of the lower pons. So the white matter constitutes of the trapezoid body. So this is the trapezoid body which is formed by the decussation of the fibers of the cochlear nuclei, the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. Then there is the medial lemniscus. So there will be a chain of lemniscus here. So starting from medial side to the lateral side, the medial lemniscus lies more medially. Then there is spinal lemniscus. Then the trigeminal lemniscus. Okay. In addition to that, on the paramedian position, there are also the fibers of medial longitudinal fasciculus, the tectospinal tract and rubrospinal tract. So what are all these tracts you have already studied in the medulla. So what is a trapezoid body? So it is formed by the decussation of the fibers which are arising from the ventral and dorsal cochlear nuclei. So these fibers will relay in the superior olivary nucleus. The medial longitudinal fasciculus, so it is formed by the fibers which connects the 3rd, 4th and 6th as well as the 8th cranial nerves. The main function is it controls the movements of the, it coordinates the movements of the eyes and head and neck. So this is a picture to show the formation of the trapezoid body here. So these are the cochlear nuclei, so which crosses towards the opposite side and reaches the superior olivary nucleus. So now to summarize the section or the facial colliculus. So this is the basilar part and this is the tegmental part. So the basilar part is the gray matter is pontine nuclei. The white matter is the longitudinal fibers which is represented as dots here and the transverse fibers. Whereas in the tegmentum, the gray matter constitutes of all the cranial nerve nuclei, that is abducent nuclei, the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, the salivatory nucleus, okay, the nucleus of the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve, the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei. So these are all the gray matter. The white matter constitutes of all the lemnisci, spinal lemnisci, medial lemnisci, spinal lemnisci and the trigeminal, and also the bundles present paramedian position, that is the medial longitudinal fasciculus, tectospinal and rubrospinal tracts. Okay, so this picture you have to practice well to explain the features of the cross section of the pons at the level of facial colliculus. So this is a complete picture showing the both the basilar part and the tegmental part. And on the ventral side here you can see the elevation, that is the facial colliculus. So that is about the section at the level of the lower pons. Now coming to the section at the upper pons. So the section at the upper pons, it is called motor and sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So the gray matter, similarly it contains the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve and the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Whereas, so the only difference of the upper and lower pons is the nuclei is the difference. So here only trigeminal nucleus is present, whereas in the facial colliculus there is nuclei of the facial, then abducent, then vestibular and cochlear nuclei. So here there is only in the upper pons there is only the nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. So two nuclei of trigeminal nerve, the motor nucleus and sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So the white matter is similar to the white matter present in the section of the lower pons. It contains all the tracts. In addition, there is a lateral lemniscus form because the fibers of the vestibulocochlear is traversed there. Okay. Then there is medial, trigeminal and spinal lemniscus. So here you can see a series of lemnisci from medial to lateral. Okay. MTSL you can remember. Medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, spinal lemniscus and lateral lemniscus. Okay. Then you can see the section of the superior cerebellar peduncle. Since it is the upper pons, okay, in addition to the middle cerebellar peduncle, there is also the superior cerebellar peduncle present. Then similar to the section of the facial colliculus, there is medial longitudinal fasciculus, tectospinal tract and rubrospinal tract. So should compare both the sections and you should remember. So only difference what you have to remember is about the nuclei. The nuclei present in the upper pons and nuclei present in the lower pons. So the functional components of the trigeminal nerve nuclei present in this section is, so there is sensory nucleus and there is motor nucleus which carries the special visceral efferent fibers for the muscles of mastication. So again this is the same chart to show the trigeminal nerve. So this is a picture showing the motor nucleus. It is supplying all the muscles of mastication. Spinal nucleus, it is carrying the fibers of pain and temperature. Then sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve, it is giving the sensation towards the skin on the face. Okay. So now to summarize the section at the motor and sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So these are the two nuclei, the motor and sensory nuclei in the tegmental part. The rest of it remains the same. So there is the same white fibers, that is a series of lemnisci, and there is also trapezoid body. The basilar part also remains same. Okay. So only difference is instead of the abducent nucleus, facial nucleus, vestibular and the cochlear nucleus, there is presence of only the the sensory and motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve. So that is the only difference in the section. Now coming to the blood supply of the pons. So the arterial supply of the pons is by the pontine branches from the basilar artery. So this is the basilar artery which is formed by the union of two vertebral arteries. So from the basilar artery, the pontine branches will arise which will supply the pons. In addition, the terminal branch of the basilar artery which is called as the superior cerebellar artery also supplies the pons. Okay. Then another artery which is supplying is called as the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So these are the three arteries that give blood supply to the pons. The venous drainage is by the basilar venous plexus and also to the inferior petrosal sinus. In applied anatomy of the vascular lesions of the blood supply of the pons is the Raymond's syndrome, where there is hemiplegia because of the occlusion of the pontine branches of the basilar artery. So the nerves which are involved here is the sixth cranial nerve, that is the abducent nerve. Okay, because of that, the lateral rectus muscle is paralyzed, so which causes the ipsilateral paralysis that causes the squint, internal squint. The another structure which is involved here is a pyramidal tract which causes the contralateral hemiplegia. Then another syndrome is called the Millard-Gubler syndrome, which is again because of the occlusion of the pontine branches of the basilar artery. So here the seventh cranial nerve is involved, okay, which causes the ipsilateral Bell's palsy because it is supplying the muscles of the face, and also loss of taste sensation. So again here the pyramidal tract is also involved, which causes the contralateral hemiplegia. So that is about the pons. Next, coming to the midbrain. So the midbrain is the shortest part of the complete brainstem. It is very short, 2 centimeters in length. It connects the pons to the diencephalon and cerebellum. So in this picture you can see this is a medulla, this is pons, and this is the midbrain. It is connecting to the diencephalon as well as towards the cerebrum. So this midbrain has a cavity which is called as the cerebral aqueduct. So this cerebral aqueduct, it connects the third and the fourth ventricle. So the third ventricle is present in the diencephalon and the fourth ventricle is present to the junction between the cerebellum and the pons. So this is the fourth ventricle here. And the midbrain contains the nuclei, two nuclei, that is the third and the fourth cranial nerve nuclei. So the external features of the midbrain, so similar to the pons, there is ventral surface and the dorsal surface. So the ventral surface of the pons, so what you are seeing is the ventral surface of the midbrain. It shows two crura, which are called as the crura cerebri. So this is the crura cerebri. Lying in between the two crura cerebri, there is the posterior perforated substance, which is a part of the interpeduncular fossa, which is present on the base of the brain. So these two crura, they diverge from the pons towards the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, as they diverge here, they form a depression here that is called posterior perforated substance, which contains the mammillary bodies. Okay. So the cranial nerve, that is the third cranial nerve, will emerge from the midbrain, okay, on the ventral aspect. Whereas the fourth cranial nerve, that is the trochlear nerve, it emerges on the dorsal surface of the midbrain, then it comes laterally and then seen on the ventral surface. So this is the only cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve or the fourth cranial nerve is the only cranial nerve that arises from the dorsal surface of the brainstem. Rest of all the cranial nerves will arise from the ventral surface of the brainstem. So this is the dorsal surface of the midbrain. It appears like this. So you can see there are 4 elevations present on the dorsal surface, which are called as the corpora quadrigemina, which includes, okay, a pair of colliculi, a pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi. Okay. So these colliculi, okay, these are the 4 colliculi. The superior colliculi is concerned with the visual reflexes, whereas the inferior colliculus is concerned with the auditory pathway. Now this colliculi will become continuous as the brachium of superior colliculus and brachium of inferior colliculus. Just beneath and in between the two inferior colliculi, there is a tongue-like projection here which is called as frenulum veli. Okay. So from this frenulum veli, the fourth cranial nerve arises and reaches laterally and it is emerging through the ventral surface. So as I said now, this is the fourth cranial nerve which is arising from the dorsal surface. Rest of the cranial nerves are arising from the ventral surface. Now coming to the internal features. So the internal features, okay, so the midbrain is traversed by a cerebral aqueduct. So in the picture you can see here, so this is a when we take a cross section, you can see there is a cerebral aqueduct. So a line passed along the cerebral aqueduct, okay, divides the internal surface of the brain into 2 parts. Okay. So that is called as the tectum, the small portion behind the cerebral aqueduct. This part is called as the tectum, and the large anterior part here, this is called as the cerebral peduncle. So now this is a schematic picture. So on cross section, the midbrain shows the tectum and the cerebral peduncle. So the cerebral peduncle further consists of 3 parts from dorsal to ventral side: the tegmentum, the substantia nigra and the crus cerebri, which is also called as the basis pedunculi. Okay, and towards the dorsal side there is the tectum. Okay, so it contains the superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. Since this section is at inferior colliculus, so you can see there is inferior colliculus. If it is a superior colliculus, the nucleus of superior colliculus is seen. Okay, so from dorsal to ventral side, the parts of the midbrain are the tectum, the tegmentum, substantia nigra, and crus cerebri. So what is this crus cerebri? So the crus cerebri, okay, this is the crus cerebri here. It is semilunar on cross section and it is situated anterolateral to the substantia nigra. So this is substantia nigra and this is the crus cerebri here. So this crus cerebri, when you trace upwards, it is continuous with the internal capsule that reaches towards the cerebrum. Okay, and mainly the crus cerebri contains the descending tracts which are arising from the cortex, the cerebral cortex. So cerebral cortex has different lobes. So it has the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. So depending on the fibers arising from each lobe of the cerebral cortex, okay, the fibers are arranged in 3 columns here. The medial most 1/6 of the column consists of the fibers arising from the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. So they are called as the frontopontine. The middle 2/3 consists of the fibers, that is corticonuclear and corticospinal fibers. Whereas the lateral 1/3 consists of the temporopontine, parietopontine and occipitopontine fibers. So these are all nothing but the fibers of the pyramidal tract. Next is substantia nigra. So substantia nigra, it is crescentic shaped and it is curved or crescentic shaped. It is pigmented because of the presence of melanin pigment. Okay, and it lies between the tegmentum. So this is called tegmentum and crus cerebri. So it is lodged in between the tegmentum and the crus cerebri. So it has a concavity surface which is smooth and it is towards the tegmentum, and the other surface is rough, okay, which is present towards the crus cerebri. So depending on the presence of the amount of melanin present here, there is the dark pigmentation and lighter pigmentation here. So the part of the substantia nigra which has darkly pigmented and the melanin is more compactly present here, which is that part is called pars compacta, and the part which is present towards the crus cerebri where the melanin is less in amount, so that is called as the pars reticularis. So this is pars reticularis and this is pars compacta. So this substantia nigra, it has connections with the basal ganglia. So where the fibers reach the substantia nigra from the basal ganglia, which carry the GABA neurons that has inhibitory action on the pars reticularis of the substantia nigra. So in turn, the dopaminergic fibers from the pars compacta reach towards the basal ganglia, which again has the inhibitory action on the corpus striatum that inhibits the tremors. Okay. So in Parkinson's disease, because of the diminished secretion of the dopamine, okay, so where the substantia nigra, the melanin component and the dopamine component is less in nature, less in amount, it leads to the Parkinson's disease. Okay. So now coming to the internal features of the tegmentum. So what till now we have seen the tectum which contains the colliculi, superior and inferior colliculi. Then you have seen substantia nigra and the crus cerebri. So the main difference between the sections of the midbrain, 2 sections of the midbrain lies in the tegmentum. Okay. So first, what is the tegmentum? So it is upward continuation of the tegmentum of pons and it lies between substantia nigra and the tectum. So similar to the other sections, the tegmentum contains the grey matter and white matter which differs in the upper and lower levels. So by taking a cross section at the 2 levels, we'll see what is the difference of the grey and white matter in the tegmentum. So now this is a section at the inferior colliculus. Okay. So in this section of the inferior colliculus here, so now this is the tectum part, this is the tegmentum part, and this is the crus substantia nigra, and this is crus cerebri. Okay. So we are not going to study now the crus cerebri because it is same on all the sections and substantia nigra also. So now going to explain only the tegmentum part. So this tegmentum part, the gray matter contains nucleus of mesencephalic and trochlear nucleus, and these nucleus are present surrounding the cerebral aqueduct. There is a gray matter which is called periaqueductal gray matter. So located within the periaqueductal gray matter, there is the nucleus of trochlear nerve and the nucleus of the mesencephalic, nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Okay. Then there is a nucleus of the inferior colliculus which has connections with the auditory pathway. Okay. So these are the three nuclei present in the tegmentum of the section of inferior colliculus. So inferior colliculus, what you have to remember is it is concerned with the trochlear nerve and it is concerned with the nucleus of inferior colliculus. Okay. So here the fibers of the trochlear nerve arising from the trochlear nucleus run by the side of the cerebral aqueduct of the gray matter and reach towards the dorsal surface. They decussate and emerge from the dorsal surface of the midbrain. Now the white matter. So the white matter contains the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncles. So this is a midbrain. So midbrain is connected to the cerebellum through superior cerebellar peduncle. So there is decussation of the fibers of superior cerebellar peduncle, and next to that there is a series of lemnisci from medial to lateral. The medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, spinal and lateral lemniscus. Then similarly, like section in the pons, there is the medial longitudinal fasciculus, tectospinal tract and rubrospinal tract. So till now whatever sections you have studied, these are the common features. Presence of medial longitudinal fasciculus, tectospinal tract, rubrospinal tract and the presence of lemnisci is a common feature. Okay. So to summarize the section of the midbrain at the inferior colliculus, okay, from dorsal to ventral side. So on the dorsal side there is a tectum which contains the nucleus of inferior colliculus. The tegmentum contains gray matter which includes the nuclei of mesencephalic nucleus and trochlear nucleus. Arising from trochlear nucleus, the fibers emerge through the dorsal surface after the decussation or after crossing. Then white matter consists of the lemnisci and the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle. Then there is substantia nigra and the crus cerebri. Next, coming to the other section of the midbrain, that is the section at superior colliculus. So the superior colliculus section, the tegmentum part, the gray matter includes again two cranial nerve nuclei. So here the cranial nerve nuclei present in the periaqueductal gray matter is the nucleus of oculomotor nerve. So oculomotor nerve nucleus has many components, one of which is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Okay. So now the fibers arising from the oculomotor nucleus, they run ventrally crossing the red nucleus here and they emerge through the ventral surface of the midbrain. Okay. So these are the fibers which are emerging. So there is no decussation or crossing like the trochlear nerve. Okay. So they arise on the, they emerge on the same side here. Okay. So the another nucleus is the nucleus of superior colliculus. Since the section is at the superior colliculus, so there will be the nucleus of superior colliculus. Then in addition there is a pretectal nucleus which lies between the periaqueductal gray matter and the nucleus of superior colliculus. Okay. Then there is another large mass of gray matter, very important feature in this level, that is the presence of red nucleus. Okay. So presence of red nucleus, pretectal nucleus and oculomotor nucleus are the three important features present at the section at this level. So now the functional components of the oculomotor nerve. So they are general somatic efferent fibers and the general visceral efferent fibers. So which will supply the muscles of the eye, the extraocular muscles of the eye, and except the two muscles. Okay, that is the lateral rectus and superior oblique. The rest of all the extraocular muscles are supplied by this oculomotor nerve. In addition, it supplies the sphincter pupillae and ciliaris muscle. Now coming to the white matter at the superior colliculus. So the white matter constitutes two decussations, the dorsal and ventral decussations. The dorsal, so this is the dorsal tegmental decussation and this is the ventral tegmental decussation. The dorsal tegmental decussation is formed because of the fibers arising from the tectal nucleus, that is tectospinal fibers as well as tectobulbar fibers. Whereas the ventral decussation is formed by the fibers arising from the red nucleus. So the fibers of both the red nucleus, they cross each other here, that forms the ventral tegmental decussation. Okay. So similar to the other sections, there is again the medial longitudinal fasciculus, but this medial longitudinal fasciculus, it lies lateral to the oculomotor nucleus here. So this is the position of the medial longitudinal fasciculus here. So then there is medial lemnisci, spinal lemnisci and trigeminal lemnisci here. There is no lateral lemniscus because in the inferior colliculus level itself, the auditory pathway has relayed there. So there is no lateral lemniscus. Only 3 lemnisci are present here. Then there is emergence of the fibers of the oculomotor nerve. So these are the white fibers present at the level of superior colliculi. So to summarize this section, both the gray matter, white matter here. So this is the tectum part, the tegmentum part, substantia nigra and crus cerebri. The tectum part is containing the nucleus of superior colliculus. Then there is mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve present in the periaqueductal gray matter. Then there is nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. Then the red nucleus. So these are all the gray matter. Okay. White matter is the lemnisci and the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Then the two decussations, the dorsal and ventral tegmental decussations. So sometimes the red nucleus can be asked as a short question. So this red nucleus is present in the midbrain and it is involved in the motor coordination. It is pink in color, so it is called, in the first sections it is pink in color, so it is called as the red nucleus, and the color is because of the presence of iron content in the nucleus. And it has two parts. In the upper part it is called as parvocellular part, and in the lower part it is called as the magnocellular part. The location of the red nucleus, it is present in the tegmentum part of the midbrain next to the substantia nigra. The connections of the red nucleus, it is related to the extrapyramidal tract. So where it relays the impulses from the cerebral cortex as well as from the cerebellum to the thalamus and spinal cord. So that's why the afferents and efferents are. So the afferents constitute of corticorubral fibers from the cortex to the red nucleus that carry the motor and premotor areas from the cerebral cortex. Then dentatorubral fibers, there is a nucleus in the cerebellum called dentate nucleus. So the fibers arise from the dentate nucleus and they cross towards the opposite side, okay, to reach the red nucleus. Whereas the efferents are from the red nucleus, the efferents are called as the rubrospinal fibers or tract and rubrothalamic, which reaches towards the spinal cord and the thalamus. The another nucleus, important nucleus in this section is the pretectal nucleus. So it lies lateral to the superior colliculus. So in the previous sections you have seen here. So it is lying lateral to the superior colliculus. And it receives fibers from the retina as well as from the visual cortex through the optic nerve and the superior brachium. So here you can see this is a tegmental part. This is superior colliculus here. Okay, and here this is the pretectal nucleus. Okay, so the fibers carry these efferent fibers are carried from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of oculomotor nerve here to the pretectal nucleus, from which the fibers run towards the and join with the oculomotor nerve to supply, where they relay with the ciliary ganglion and supply the ciliaris muscle and constrictor pupillary muscles. Okay, so it is involved in the pupillary light reflex. So coming to the blood supply of the midbrain, it is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, which is again a branch from the basilar artery. Then it is supplied by superior cerebellar artery. So these are the two arteries supplying the midbrain. The venous drainage drains into the basal vein and great cerebral vein. So the names of the veins you will get familiar when you study about the blood supply of the brain. So the vascular lesions of the midbrain includes two lesions, okay, two syndromes. One is the Weber syndrome and the other one is the Benedict's syndrome. So both the syndromes are caused because of the occlusion of the posterior cerebral artery. So in Weber's syndrome, the oculomotor nerve and the crus cerebri are involved, whereas in Benedict's syndrome, the red nucleus and medial lemniscus are involved here. So in Weber's syndrome, where the oculomotor nerve is and the crus cerebri are involved, it leads to the ipsilateral ophthalmoplegia and the contralateral paralysis of the lower part of the face, tongue and the leg. So since the medial rectus muscle is also involved, there is drooping of the upper eyelids and the pupil is dilated and fixed to the light accommodation. Whereas in Benedict's syndrome, it is almost similar to the Weber's syndrome, but here the red nucleus and medial lemnisci are involved here, which causes the contralateral hemianesthesia and involuntary movements of the limbs of the opposite side. There is another syndrome called dorsal midbrain syndrome or called Parinot's syndrome. So it is called dorsal midbrain syndrome because the dorsal part, the tectum part of the midbrain is involved here. So in the tectum part of this midbrain, which is responsible for the vision and supplying the muscles of the eye, so there will be pupillary disturbances and there will be false Argyll-Robertson appearance of false Argyll-Robertson pupils, and also there is absence of convergence. So these are the important questions related to today's topic. Okay. The external features of the PONS is important. Okay. The sections, drawing of the sections at the level of facial colliculus, that is lower PONS, and the upper PONS, both the sections are important. Then drawing and labeling the sections of the midbrain, two sections, that is at the level of inferior colliculus and superior colliculus. Then external features of midbrain. So the red nucleus and substantia nigra can be asked as short notes, 5 mark questions. Then for 2 marks, the short answers is crus cerebri, the pretectal nucleus, describe the anatomical basis for Parkinson's disease, then what is Weber's syndrome, Benedict's syndrome and Millard-Gubler syndrome. Okay. So that is about today's topic. Any doubts?
Ma'am, I had a doubt.
Yeah, tell me.
Ma'am, in the section between upper pons and lower pons, in the upper pons, you said that the trigeminal, both the nucleus are seen. Ma'am, is the mesencephalic
In the upper
nucleus
pons,
also seen?
the major nucleus seen is the mesencephalic nucleus. No, mesencephalic nucleus is seen in the midbrain.
Okay.
In the pons, mainly the spinal nucleus and motor nucleus is seen in the pons. So the trigeminal nucleus usually has 4 nuclei. One is the sensory, the motor, the spinal nucleus and mesencephalic nucleus. These are the 4. Okay, mesencephalic nucleus is seen in the midbrain. Sensory and motor nucleus is seen in the pons. The spinal nucleus is seen in the medulla, so which have studied during the sections of medulla. So
So
trigeminal,
mesencephalic nucleus is not seen in upper pons, ma'am.
no, it is not seen in the upper pons. It is seen only in the midbrain.
Okay.
So this is a nerve which is a trigeminal nerve which is present along the entire length of the brainstem. Okay, in the medulla it is spinal nucleus, and in the pons it is motor and sensory nucleus, and in the midbrain it is mesencephalic nucleus. Okay, so the other nuclei which are present in the pons, what nuclei you have to remember is this motor and sensory nucleus of trigeminal, the abducent. So whatever nerves you are seeing on the surface, no, the same nerves, abducent nerve, facial nerve, and vestibulocochlear nucleus. In addition to trigeminal, in the lower pons. Okay, in the upper pons is mainly the trigeminal only. Okay, there is no other nuclei there. Any other doubts anybody has? So these two sections are very important. Two sections of pons, especially the section at facial colliculus and the two sections of the midbrain. So only the drawing can be asked as a short notes question. Draw a neat label of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus, sometimes at the level of inferior colliculus. So practice these two sections very clearly and properly.